there was actually a fair amount of gay equality and gay rights work that was happening prior to June of 1969. It's not as though everything just happened all at once, but a lot of that was happening more quietly, and it was nowhere near as organized as it was after that. When the contemporary gay rights movement began at the Stonewall Rebellion, there was a marked difference between gay Republicans and gay Democrats in the United States, and those differences became more pronounced as we got into the late 1970s and 1980s, when Log Cabin Republicans started becoming more formally organized. If you're meeting with other LGBT advocates, especially Democrats, over the course of your time here, I invite you to ask them about their perspective on this and to challenge them on this. I hope you challenge me on this too. But largely, the stark difference between the LGBT rights movement on the left and the LGBT rights movement on the right is one of what the ultimate end of this movement is. LGBT Republicans are looking ultimately for assimilation into American culture. We believe we are no worse nor no better than anyone else. And we were fighting for things like open service in the United States military and marriage equality at a time when the LGBT left thought that those two things were anathema, that the last thing the LGBT community should be fighting for should be, in their words, support for the military-industrial complex and support for a heteronormative institution rooted in patriarchy and bourgeois culture like marriage. And on the LGBT left, their movement for equality was not about assimilation, which they thought was dangerous, but sexual liberation. And that instead of blending into American culture, the LGBT equality movement should be all about carving out our own niche for the LGBT community and celebrating our differences rather than what unites us. And when you think about it, that really puts the movement of the LGBT Democrats and LGBT Republicans at odds with one another. When the left believes that what LGBT Republicans are fighting for is anathema to LGBT culture, it can create some frictions between their side of the aisle and ours. For decades, those differences were whispered, but I've actually found increasingly in the time since Donald Trump won the presidency, specifically in the 2016 election, the LGBT movement in the United States on the left has actually come around to embracing what I feel are really its roots in sexual liberation, and that has been counterbalanced by the work of Log Cabin Republicans that continues to push for assimilation into American culture. So happy to take your questions and get into some granular discussions about legislation that we're fighting for, candidates that we're supporting in the current election cycle, or to discuss more broadly the work that we're doing here. It's interesting, I would just point out, before I open up to questions, I had a very good friend just yesterday from the UK who was visiting, a straight ally who's a conservative. He was here for the YAF conference, Conservative Youth Conference, that was just taking place concurrently. I don't know if any of you had time to go there while you were here, but I guess it's just a curious coincidence. But I've had a number of interactions with LGBT conservatives in particular, from the UK in the past, and I'm happy to continue the relationship here with all of you today, whether you're conservative or not.
Yes. So I kind of wanted to ask you, when we looked at the bio that you produced, you talked about the idea of marrying equality but also kind of Republican values in terms of military spending or a lack of government sort of interference or on different levels. And I'm really interested to know what you see as equality, because I think that legal equalities, for example, so marriage equality, ultimately don't produce justice in a society which is unequal. So, for example, you can have marriage equality and it's legal equality, but what do you do when you still have increased risk of homelessness, increased risk of drug dependency, all of these aspects that are, I suppose, secondary equality or secondary laws that could be passed? As someone who's maybe less interested in government involvement, how do you reconcile those two things?
Well, I mean, I would say this, that and I'd also maybe paint my answer to this question in a little more broad strokes to give you a better idea of where we come from again as Log Cabin Republicans. I often ask my colleagues on the left, what is the ultimate goal of our movement? Is it to achieve equality for the LGBT community, or is it to pass laws? And often on the left, the sole vehicle for achieving equality is a legislative end. When it comes to the quantifiably higher risks of homelessness, drug abuse that members of the LGBT community face, I don't know that the greatest answer to those woes is one through government. There are tremendous organizations, nonpartisan organizations within the United States, nonprofit organizations and nonpartisan organizations that are dedicated solely to combating things like LGBT suicide, LGBT homelessness, LGBT drug abuse, and I am more inclined to ceding these challenges to, I mean, it's not quite the private sector, but it's certainly people who are laser focused on combating these ills, as opposed to creating government programs that are saddled with finding those solutions.
I mean, so for example, one of the issues that I didn't mention, but it's probably one of the biggest, is mental health issues. Do you not see healthcare being a massive part of that? And the government's involvement in healthcare is obviously huge. Is that not something that you think would work together, or do you think it's not the remit of the government to be part of that drive for equality? I
mean, it bears mentioning that Log Cabin Republicans was not supportive of Obamacare when that passed in the United States. I mean, I would just say that while there are heightened risks of mental illness,
physical illness as well,
which leads to suicide, physical illness, right, drug addiction, etc. There are individuals and organizations out there that specialize in these things, and I think they are best equipped to handle that.
So you don't think that healthcare can help mental health issues and achieve equality in that way?
I'm saying I do, but again, I'm saying that there are organizations out there that, whether it's through supplemental care or direct care, that I think are best equipped to handle those situations.
Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, this is really fascinating for us, particularly because I feel like, especially because of the, I guess, do you guys still have, how do I put this? I guess we've got a very particular view of what sort of Republican looks like, especially from
Tell me, what is it? What is it?
No. But from a UK perspective, in terms of, I guess, with the political spectrum and it being really conservative, really focused on traditional values and what that looks like. So obviously, yeah. I was particularly interested in coming here because I was like, I guess it's a really niche group in some senses because
that's fair.
And I guess what are some of the challenges that you found with, again, even identifying as an LGBTQI Republican group? Like, what are some of the challenges you faced in terms of perception? Because again, that was, I guess, like, I was pretty excited about this because I thought, wow, this is for some people it might look like an oxymoron in some senses, even having Republican and LGBTQI together in the same words. So that's what, I'm just interested to know.
To add to that, do you face any internal conflict with other Republicans looking at the group?
Two questions. Let me unpack that. But it's funny that you mention that because my experience is in the UK you have LGBTI plus conservatives, right? Isn't that an official official branch
very
of the.
small.
Very small.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot
Really
and it's a
niche.
lot less discussed than I think.
Exactly. Yeah,
It's
which is why. Yeah.
And there's also LGBT that
Yeah.
exists in the
Mhm.
UK also and in Canada. Okay,
I
but
think
I
I've
guess
heard
maybe
it.
a little less organized than Log Cabin Republicans.
Probably,
is.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing. I think they're a lot less sort of organized and also a lot
But
less
then you have,
public
like-
as well.
And you also have more openly gay conservative MPs.
MPs,
right?
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
quite a I don't know if it's quite a number, but what, maybe 5 or so,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
something
Yeah,
around
no,
there.
definitely,
That's 5 more than we have in the United States right now.
Okay.
In at least in the United States Congress. There, I guess the short answer to your question is yes, we are something of a niche. But there was a survey that was done about 3 or 4 years ago of just the general LGBT community. That I believe they polled several hundred or maybe even several thousand individuals. And on the whole, the majority of respondents identified as somewhat conservative or very conservative. It doesn't mean that they registered with the Republican Party. In fact, far from it. If you look at the actual numbers of exit polling from 1994 through till 2016, the numbers of individuals who identify as gay or lesbian, we don't really have enough numbers to get a representative sample of the transgender community. But the number of individuals who identify as gay or lesbian who vote Republican vacillates between 14% and 31%. Dependent upon the election cycle, that's not an insignificant number of people. And when you're getting into, say, the 2016 election, for example, where a number of states were decided by razor-thin margins, you're potentially looking at numbers that could put their thumb on the scale in order to tilt the election for one individual or another. When it comes to people who choose to align themselves with the Republican Party, who are part of the LGBT community, it's largely because, in my experience, and we don't really have polling to bear this out, so this is anecdotal, but it's people who do not see themselves as single-issue voters. And in the United States, the Democratic Party has essentially declared that if you are a member of the LGBT community, you must prioritize 2 issues when you vote. One is marriage equality, and one is LGBT non-discrimination legislation. And I would add that Log Cabin Republicans, as a matter of policy, has supported both of those things. But you know what? If you are a member of the LGBT community and you are more likely to be faced with violence because of who you are, who you love, attacked, you could pass all the hate crimes legislation you want. Log Cabin Republicans has supported hate crimes legislation in the past. But perhaps the best way to deter a would-be homophobe from attacking a gay person in the first place is to have that person wonder in advance if the person they're thinking about attacking is able to exercise their Second Amendment right and whether or not they are concealed carrying a firearm right now. If you are a member of the LGBT community, you might well feel that the death tax, which we have in the United States, the estate tax, which prior to the Obergefell decision actually unfairly targeted same-sex couples with a higher tax rate, is something that you should be prioritizing. If you are a member of the LGBT community and you feel that the human rights abuses that are taking place in nations that essentially have a radical Islamist theocracy in place are wrong, perhaps you would align yourself with the Republican Party over the Democratic Party. So I guess all this is to say that there are many reasons why LGBT Americans can and do consider the Republican Party, even if it seems against what one might think is the conventional way that one would naturally gravitate. To your question, are there frictions within the Republican Party? Of course there are. I mean, it's actually the reason why Log Cabin Republicans exists and continues to exist. We were founded to fight a anti-gay Republican bigot in the state of California who is pushing this anti-gay referendum, and we continue to stand as a counterweight to anti-LGBT voices within the GOP. I mean, most famously, recently, we took a very strong stand against the Republican Party platform that was drafted in 2016, which was extremely acrimonious to the LGBT community in particular. But if you're in the shoes that I am, you start seeing that there are many more shades of gray within the GOP than one might assume if you're from the outside looking in. Certainly, if you're from another country and you're looking at politics across the Atlantic. If you're a Republican in, say, someone like former Senator Scott Brown, who believed marriage is between one man and one woman, but who actually voted to allow open service for gay individuals in the United States military, repealing our Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, does that make him an anti-gay bigot? I would say probably not. If someone says that they support so-called traditional marriage, but also say that it's wrong for businesses to discriminate against the LGBT community and believes that the Supreme Court's 2015 marriage decision is settled law, are they an anti-gay bigot? Again, I would say probably not. Democrats would probably disagree with me. But a large part of the work of Log Cabin Republicans is based not only in taking a stand for traditional conservative values as LGBT Republicans, but also pulling our Republican brothers and sisters to a place of greater LGBT acceptance. And those are challenges, but yes.
It's so interesting hearing about the sort of dichotomy and friction between traditional values and outright homophobia. So it's just, again, it's fascinating. Like, I think that one of the differences between the USA and the UK and the way we tackle homophobia, like, I feel that our response has not been so heavily politicized. I feel that it's more been treated like as a civil rights movement, as opposed to having sort of strictly left-wing or strictly right-wing responses to it. So I was just going to ask you personally, with regard to particularly assimilation, how do you reconcile the traditional values that you would find in the Republican Party with the sort of homophobia that can be found there, like the idea that maybe gay people shouldn't have children or gay marriage shouldn't be allowed? Like you said, it's not a black and white issue. There's complexity. Not everybody agrees on all the same issues. So, like, particularly as a Republican, how do you sort of combat that when you say, I believe the same traditional values as you do, I align myself with the same beliefs as you, but your beliefs are homophobic and I'm a gay person. So how do you deal with that?
I mean, my glib response is that I will tell these individuals that I am a stronger Republican than they are. If you support things like family values, you should welcome the idea that two men or two women want to settle down in a monogamous relationship and raise a family. And right now in this country, we actually have a crisis in foster care and youth who are not adopted. And I say this as someone who, prior to my work in Log Cabin Republicans, I worked in communications and PR, and for a number of years I was the head of public relations for one of the largest foster care agencies in the state of New York. And I saw firsthand just how many kids go through the system, sometimes from a very young age, 4, 5, 6, straight through the age of 18 without finding a forever home. So, and a lot of these same Republicans that will decry the idea of two men settling down in a relationship and having a family as being somehow antithetical to their Christian values, will also admonish those same guys if they are engaging in promiscuous sexual behavior. And so there's almost no winning sometimes with these people, right? Like, on the one hand, they'll decry gay people for being promiscuous, and then when we try to turn around and say, okay, well, we don't want to do that anymore, we want to settle down and raise a family, well, these same people will say that we can't do that either. But to me, there is no daylight between my support of same-sex marriage and Republicans at least espousing family values. There is no daylight between my being a Republican and supporting things like LGBT non-discrimination legislation if we are part of the party that always beats our chest around the fact that we supported the Civil Rights Act in the United States. This is what essentially tore down the major barriers for the Black community in the United States to things like voting, tearing down things like colored-only water fountains or colored-only restrooms in the United States. Republicans, rightfully so, are proud of the leadership that they displayed in passing that, but there should be a similar support for non-discrimination legislation for the LGBT community. And I would add also that there are certainly a number of bright spots there where Republicans, the trajectory in the United States is Republicans growing in support for these things, not lessening in support for these things. And we have had numerous pieces of legislation that moved on sometimes the state and certainly the federal level where Republicans have openly supported that legislation and in some cases led on it. But it is a challenge. But you know what? That's their problem. It's not mine.
It's really interesting, yeah. It's sort of like changing the narrative, like what do family values look like? What does inclusion look like? What does being American look like? Because I feel like from abroad, at least, it can seem that being traditional Republican American means being a Bible-bashing Christian, homophobic, very misogynistic sometimes, and it's actually really refreshing and encouraging to see you fighting for inclusion within your party and in line with your political beliefs as well.
And it's important, you know what? Like it's and necessary, I would say. While LGBT Democrats might think the notion of an LGBT Republican is absolutely ridiculous, and in some cases might think that we are fighting against our own interests, if you put all your faith into a single political party, your destiny is to be ignored by one and taken for granted by the other. And so as much as LGBT Democrats might scoff at the notion of log cabin Republicans, I often remind my friends on the other side of the aisle that our strategy and tactics might be different, but ultimately we are together working toward a more equal America.
Yeah, it sort of surpasses party politics in a sense, like it transcends it because you're fighting for equality just in very different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
How do you feel about Pride parades?
I'm fine with them. We often, our chapters around the country have marched in pride parades in the past. When I was a little bit more background, I'm the first head of Log Cabin Republicans National Organization who started as a local volunteer myself. I started with our New York chapter. And I've marched in New York pride parades. There are folks familiar with The Onion? We have like a satirical, there's a really funny Onion article that came out I think 8 years ago.
We'll show you later.
It's a satirical
That
it takes it to the extreme and mocks.
There was an Onion headline from 2010, again, satirical, but it said something like, Gay Pride Parade takes gay rights back 50 years. And it was essentially talking about, it said it was talking about all these straight allies that were going to a pride parade and saw a bunch of guys running around in assless chaps and a bunch of drag queens marching around, and it can look. I think that's part of our LGBT culture, and it's something worth celebrating. When I've marched in pride parades in the past, I was dressed a little more conservatively than that.
As is your freedom and choice.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. Maybe I'm a little ambivalent about pride parades.
So you talked earlier about the idea that actually you'd rather leave it up to non-profits or other organisations to deal with these particular issues. Why is it that other issues you say you're interested in the government being involved in, or you think legislation can help, whereas it wouldn't help, or you're not interested in it the other side, if that makes sense? What stuff would you see as the remit or not?
It's incorrect to say that I'm totally disinterested in say, helping helping nonprofits. I think, again, like there are federal grant programs that we have
Yeah.
that can help nonprofits that are dedicated to helping LGBT homelessness, for example. But I guess specific to your question, I guess I have not given it enough thought to give you a thoughtful response to that.
That's very fair.
Yeah,
Very
fair. Our main push of late has been and continues to be federal non-discrimination legislation, and that's what's getting the bulk of our attention.
Mm.
It's very interesting. Like, it seems like a big part of American values, at least I'm learning, is what role does the government and the state play in sort of responsibility for the individual. Like, it seems that there seems to be a massive ethos here of individual freedoms, being a self-determined person, particularly in terms of business and making your own way in the world. So it's sort of like when it comes to implementing anti-discrimination legislation, there doesn't seem to be as direct pathway in terms of like the state helping the individual, if that makes sense. So like it seems like it would be quite difficult to, on a mass scale, implement real like legislation that would protect LGBT people, because it seems that's the responsibility of local government in the States. Whereas, I mean, I know in England, like when we legalized gay marriage, it was nationwide, straight up. Like there wasn't a vote, there wasn't a referendum, I don't think.
No,
I think it was
that
just
was
like
voted
in Parliament.
That was voted in Parliament.
Yeah.
in Parliament, yeah, but like not like a nationwide referendum
No.
or anything.
The Ireland was the first one to do that.
Yeah, and in New York State, where I'm from, we passed marriage equality in a Republican-controlled legislature, but that also was not by referendum. There were only a handful of instances in the United States prior to the Supreme Court's 2015 ruling where there was a popular vote that actually led to marriage equality in that state. One was in Maine, another was in Maryland. I believe those were the only two.
We did it back in 2012.
In Washington? Yeah, so in Washington as well.
This honestly is fascinating. And you mentioned a second ago about sort of the relationship that you have with the church, and obviously the church is quite, especially particularly in the United Kingdom, it's quite different in the UK because we've sort of
have a state church.
Yeah, exactly. We have an institutionalized sort of version of the church, and then you have sort of outer sphere in that sense. Whereas here, of course, it's not really, well, it's not the same ultimately, but they're still quite, influential in a lot of senses.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, what has your relationship been with, and it's so broad because it's like the church, but like, I guess, what's been your sort of relations within that, and rather than the sort of like social media things that we see where there's like people sort of holding up a plaque, which was amazing, by the way, like, it was great, but as in like, obviously you're talking about in the policy sphere,
yeah.
How has that sort of interaction come rather than sort of the grassroots?
It's important to note that this country was founded by Puritans, and we are still feeling the effects of our Puritan founders centuries after they landed here, right? I have a friend who says, if only the Germans got here first. The Germans came here just after the Puritans. But by that point, it was, we had already established, so while, and while our founding fathers did establish a separation between church and state, there are not just deeply religious roots in American culture, but puritanical roots that seep into everything from the cultural opinions on things like same-sex marriage to even like, we have these things, blue laws in the United States. In certain states, for example, you can't sell, liquor stores cannot be open on a Sunday, or you can't sell beer after 8 o'clock, things like that. But those are all, downstream from the fact that we were founded by people who held those beliefs near and dear, and a deference to religion and people of faith is something that is a bedrock part of American culture, and most definitely the Republican Party in the United States. Democrats have moved to an extremely secular place in their politics, and it has led to the Republican Party, by design or by default, being a home for people who prioritize their faith. That, as one can imagine, presents challenges at Log Cabin Republicans when people, even though we have separation of church and state in the United States, a lot of people vote their faith,
Of course, yeah.
and feel a moral obligation to vote for candidates that oppose same-sex marriage, among other things. I'm someone who's personally pro-life. We don't take a position on that in Log Cabin Republicans, and I would also add that I'm a Christian myself and a practicing one at that. My partner and I go to a Baptist church every Sunday, and my faith is something that's very important to me. We, as a result of the religious polarization that's taken place in the United States, secular Democrats and largely evangelical Christian Republicans, there is a prevalence of opinion that if you are a member of the LGBT community, you cannot be a person of faith. Or if you are a person of faith, you cannot be supportive of the LGBT community. How depressing is that to think about? How wrong is that also to think about, that gay people are incompatible with Christianity, and the Christianity that supposedly advocates the golden rule of love thy neighbor as yourself cannot be supportive of the LGBT community. It's one of these things that leads to a very high suicide rate among the LGBT community, specifically in the United States. That's the challenging news. The good news is that Log Cabin Republicans, I believe, is uniquely situated to bridge that cultural divide in the United States, and it's one of the main things that we're doing at present is building bridges with the Catholic Church, with evangelical Christians. Our country's Vice President, Mike Pence, is kind of the head, the de facto head politically of the evangelical Christian movement in the United States, are certainly one of the most important figureheads. And even the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church in the United States. And again, what's things that can maybe give us all hope around this table is that the numbers are trending toward greater acceptance in all of those demographics. Interestingly enough, among the Mormon faith in particular, but even among evangelical Christians, the numbers are just ticking up ever so slightly, but they're moving toward a greater acceptance, or at least, and if not changing someone's dogmatic belief in the traditional view of marriage, for example, is nonetheless encouraging a live and let live view among people of faith. But that really is, I have actually said, that's the final frontier in the LGBT equality fight in the United States. And that is getting people of faith, of goodwill, and members of the LGBT community together at the table. Just to put a point on it, in 2015, that actually happened in the United States, where in the state of Utah, which is known for being deeply conservative, Republican supermajorities in both houses of the state legislature, Republican governor. In 2015 in that state, people of faith, of goodwill, and members of the LGBT community of goodwill came together at the table, literally, including members of Log Cabin Republicans of Utah. No one got everything that they were asking for, but that's the very definition of compromise. And Utah ended up passing LGBT non-discrimination legislation. And that to me gives me hope, because it shows that if people are willing to look beyond party, beyond faith, and beyond sexual orientation or gender identity, we can actually do good for everyone. Yes?
I guess where I'm from in Northern Ireland, we have, in the rest of the UK, you had Parliament voted in favour of same-sex marriage. Then to the south, in the Republic of Ireland, same-sex marriage was passed by a referendum.
That's right.
But in Northern Ireland, whilst the majority of political parties there are very much in favour of same-sex marriage, the largest party is very much against. So what we have there is a party that its greatest emphasis is on its links with the rest of the UK, but it's cut itself off from the rest of the UK by taking certain stances, say, on same-sex marriage. It's essentially a very evangelical Protestant political party. So it's now, at this moment, is still very much against same-sex marriage, despite, even in the legislature, over a majority of politicians have voted in favour of same-sex marriage. But by using certain mechanisms which are supposed to defend certain parts of the community, they have abused that to block it down. So at the moment, we're still without same-sex marriage.
Northern Ireland does not have same-sex marriage, right?
No.
No. Oh, all right.
No. So this largest party, at the same time, is working with the largest party in the rest of the UK, the Conservatives, to keep them in power.
Yeah.
So the government there, because it's been held almost to ransom, they rely on 10 MPs in this very small far-right party to stay in power. The government will not intervene. Will not intervene.
Yeah.
And give rights to the rest of the people throughout the UK. They say it's a devolved matter for Northern Ireland. But the thing is that this party, so against same-sex marriage, almost refuses to acknowledge, I'm sure there are some LGBT members within that political party, but it's almost as if they refuse to acknowledge that. Over the years, they have been said, they've been always very vocal in their anti-LGBT stance.
Mm-hmm.
It's only really been the past couple of years where you have a member of that political party has decided to join, say, a panel discussion on the week of a Pride March in Belfast there.
Yeah.
Just last week, it was almost a massive thing that the leader of the political party went to an LGBT event in the building of the legislature. But there are questions as to why that person actually attended, because it was actually sponsored by a huge business in Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
So whilst it was advertised by, say, Pink News, it was sponsored by a certain private organisation.
Yeah.
So even the motivations there are just questionable. So what I'm trying to convey is that, whilst there's probably, a large proportion of people in Northern Ireland who are very much in favour of same-sex marriage, we're being held to ransom by a political grouping that almost refuses, point blank, to provide these rights to anyone else. They are run by evangelical Christians. I'm just wondering, how do you compromise? How do you go about?
I think you actually answered your own question there, and it's there's actually a similar movement that we've had in the United States, and that is the power of business, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the United States, even in the absence of federal legislation that would protect the LGBT community, business has taken the lead, has filled that vacuum, where in the United States, if you are working for a Fortune 500 company today, without question, you are working at a company that has a formal declared policy that says we do not discriminate against people based on race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or gender identity. We saw in the state of North Carolina in 2015, which passed a piece of legislation that would have required transgender individuals to only use a restroom that matched their biological sex at birth. Corporate America swooped in, and the state of North Carolina was losing money hand over foot in terms of people who were pulling out of conventions, canceling, massive hotel blocks that they had reserved. Businesses that were looking to expand their corporate headquarters said that we're out of here. The same thing happened, I believe that same year, in the state of Indiana when Mike Pence was still the governor. He passed a piece of legislation that would have, a little complex, but essentially it would have allowed people of faith to use their religion as a means of getting standing in court if they denied service to someone, citing their faith as an example.
The cake case.
Yeah, the cake case, but it could have been many other things. It could have actually been denying, someone service at a restaurant, or a same-sex couple at a restaurant, potentially. At any rate, corporate America swooped in and said, we are not going to be doing business in the state of Indiana until this is fixed. Mike Pence ended up amending that piece of legislation to say that it cannot be used to discriminate against the LGBT community. There are there's a significant number of people on the left and in the LGBT left that are very skeptical of large corporate interests, but I would actually have embraced that in the past and said that it's actually corporate interests that have largely achieved much of the movement toward LGBT equality in the United States. It takes some doing. I don't specifically know what the lay of the land is in Northern Ireland, but as you rightly noted, it's probably no accident that the presence and the underwriting of a large corporation was responsible for this elected official's presence at this Pride event. And if you're able to harness that power of corporate interests in Northern Ireland, I think you might be surprised at how rapidly politicians see the light.